Fantastic. When technology works for you, it's very nice, doesn't it? So we'll keep our fingers crossed that that stays through the rest of it. So just so I can get a feeling for who's in the room, put your hand up if you are a student here. Okay. And if you work here? Okay. And none of the above? Okay, fantastic. So we've got a nice broad mix of people. So I'd like to start just by expanding a little bit on what you were saying and giving you a little bit of an overview. So what I'm going to talk about today is not all my own work. I won't try and take responsibility for all of it. I work with the most fantastic team at Oxford University, and we're very lucky to have had a project funded looking at some of the challenges around integrating renewable energy. And these are not just technical challenges, they're not just economic challenges, they're not just social challenges, they're not just political challenges, but they're challenges that arise when you have to kind of bring all of those things together. And so the team I work with, I want to say over the 3 years of the programme, we've probably had about 25 different people involved. Some have gone on to other careers, some are still with the programme. And they come from a very broad range of disciplinary backgrounds. And I think we span 5 different faculties in total. So we really are interdisciplinary, and we work very hard to do that. And it's not always easy, and we do have to try and learn each other's languages and take a little bit of time trying to figure out how, as my own background is in engineering, how do I speak to a social scientist when sometimes we use the same words to mean different things or different words to mean the same things. And I guess that's all a big part of the challenge. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually, I'd like to think, kind of a successful outcome of what has been a really, really exciting programme that is not yet finished, but we are 2.5 years into it. And so I'm going to talk about exploring the energy revolution. And one of the things that has come out of the programme, and one of my observations, has been that what it means is we need to simultaneously be thinking big and thinking small. And I'll talk more about what that means in a minute. But first of all, who here actually thinks that there is an energy revolution? Put your hands up if you're kind of aware of something going on that makes you feel like there's an energy revolution underway. What is it? What is happening that makes you believe that? Shout it out. Anyone?
Renewables.
Yep.
And it changing to DC sort of thing. So we don't need AC necessarily.
Yep. Oh, that's a very interesting thing. Yep, the AC-DC argument again. Anyone else seeing anything else that makes them think about the revolution?
Small scale.
Yep. We'll definitely touch on that in the talk. Anything else?
Decarbonisation.
Yep. And we'll definitely talk about that as well. And so for me, the moment that I realised that there was an energy revolution underfoot, and bear in mind, I did live in New Zealand for 5 years, and I used to come back every year, every other year for Christmas, and we would make the journey down to Cornwall, which is where my partner's from. So I'm from London, but he's from Cornwall. And this used to be the beautiful scenery that we would see on our journey down to Cornwall. And I remember then one time coming home and making that journey and seeing more of these. And almost every field that we were driving past, we were just seeing rows and rows and rows of solar panels. And it almost felt like it had happened overnight. And it kind of had. And so in the UK, the government had put out a whole lot of predictions about what they thought PV uptake would look like. And what had happened far exceeded their expectations. And so it really did feel like exciting stuff was happening overnight and sort of starting to spark a bit of a revolution. Of course, scenes like this. So this is Didcot Power Station, which is just outside of Oxford, being demolished. And so this kind of rise of renewables, more small scale, big power stations being brought to the end of their life. It's really starting to spark kind of a revolution. And so I honestly do believe that energy systems around the world, not just in the UK, but around the world, are undergoing this revolution. And I'm going to talk about the 5 Ds that I think are driving this. And so the first D, we heard about decarbonisation. I actually want to call it decarbonised development, and I'll explain why in a minute. But really, it's kind of obvious that we need to try and limit global warming. If we want to keep within the Paris Accord, trying to keep to 1.5 degrees. And that's all well and good, but what does that mean? And this is a really horrible graph to get your head around, and I'm not really expecting you to do that. But just looking at how quickly we need to start decarbonising our lives if we are going to meet that. And the one there to look at is the blue line, in my opinion. And so what we're saying is, by the end of this century, we need to be net negative in terms of carbon emissions. Not sure if that's going to happen yet, but if we want to make our way there, how can we think about doing that? And this diagram's even worse. Looks kind of like lots of colourful spaghetti strands, the sort of thing my sons would play with. But again, the only thing I really want you to take away from that is the green ones are about the electricity sector. And that's most of my work is around the electricity sector, around integrating renewables. And what you can see is that we're up first. The electricity sector has to decarbonise the most rapidly if we are to try and keep within 1.5 degrees emissions. And how are we doing? Well, the UK's doing all right. We're kind of on track. So you can see that the big blue one at the bottom, which is coal's contribution, is decreasing rapidly. And we had some lovely headlines earlier this year around how we had some sort of coal-free days and weeks. So that was very nice. We've still got quite a lot of gas. And then the purple one near the top is wind and solar, and you can see that that's starting to grow. So things are kind of hopeful for the UK. But the reason I want to say decarbonised development and not just decarbonisation is that we need to think beyond countries that already have this electricity infrastructure in place. And this is a little bit hard to see with the light in here, but this is, you can get these for yourself. So if you Google NASA black marble, you can see images of the sky at night, the world at night. And you can start to see where there is electrification because you can see the lights are on. And the difference between 2012 and if you look kind of up in the top right-hand corner, you can see quite a big difference just in 4 years in the amount of light. I'll do that again so you can have a look. 2012, 2016. I couldn't capture any more recent data than that, which is why it's just till 2016. But so we're not just talking about decarbonisation of existing systems. There are many countries around the world where people still don't have access to electricity. And that is starting to change, but we need to think about how that can be done in a decarbonised way. And some work that some of my colleagues did in the Oxford Martin programme was they looked at, well, what does that mean? And they found out from their findings showed that if we want to try and stay within this 1.5 degrees, we cannot afford to build any more fossil fuel emitting power stations after 2017. We're in 2018 now. Unless we're prepared to strand them early. And so we have to act rapidly in countries where there are already infrastructure in place. And for countries that are developing, we need to think about what are the alternatives. And so when we think about low carbon pathways, and this is a slightly out of date figure now, so some of these colours may have moved along, but what you can see is you can see on the x-axis we've got the ecological footprint of consumption. So sort of kind of linked to carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, and on the vertical we've got human development. And so I guess the goal is to be where no one is, which is that top left-hand corner, which is high development and low emissions. And so countries that have developed significantly, but unfortunately who have a large consumption footprint, need to figure out how to decarbonise. And countries that have the lower footprint but lower development, we need to figure out how they can develop in a way that doesn't cause significant environmental damage. So we have these two conflicting challenges going on, but we need to solve them both if we want to think about this energy transition. So the second D I want to talk about is decentralisation. So really thinking about how we're shifting from a grid that's like this, where you've got your big power station at one end, your end users at the other end, and power's kind of just flowing down from one to the other, to something that's a bit more dynamic, where we may still have our big power stations, and perhaps some of them will be renewable, but where we also have low carbon energy sources in communities, in buildings, in residential buildings, in schools, in offices, and so on. And so we're starting to kind of shift what we mean, and this is already happening. So what always fascinates me is that despite the amount of small-scale renewables that exist on the system, and you can just look around and see loads of them, PV on people's roofs, there's very little visibility on the grid about where those are. And so there was this project in the Oxfordshire area called the People's Power Station, where we're starting to try and map where all these projects are. And so you can see just within the small footprint of Oxford there, how many projects there are that all overlap. And most of them are PV. So we're starting to see a lot of decentralised generation here. Again, it's not just about what's going on in countries that already have grids, in developed countries. Some of my colleagues have been doing work in Kenya. So this is looking at how can areas that are remote, that don't have centralised grids, that don't have access to electricity, how can they start to think about new ways to develop in a decentralised way? And so here you can see for this community that the houses are actually very, very widely spread. And a conventional grid doesn't make sense for this community. What we looked at was what would make sense. And so one of the solutions that my colleagues came up with was around having a hub, a small hub that you can see in the nano hub right at the centre, and it's got PV on the roof and batteries in the hub, and it's connected to an area of economic activity. And in this village, I think it was a posher mill, but it could be a different economic activity in different villages. And then rather than try and connect wires to all the homes on the outside, which can be quite expensive, they started with the development by using the batteries as a cable-free distribution network, if you like. So people would go along to the hub, pick up their battery, take it to their home, use it, take it back to the hub, exchange it for one that was charged, and switch that way. And it provided enough energy to meet the needs of that community as they started to develop. But things needed to change over time, and so the second step was then looking at a DC, you said AC to DC, yeah, so having a DC low voltage network, one of the cheapest ways to do the development in this country. So having the batteries remain in the home to provide some storage for the home at times when perhaps the sun wasn't shining and the PV wasn't generating. And so it provided the next step in that development. And then that can be replicated in other villages and scaled by connecting them up. And so by changing the way we think about things and shifting from this kind of centralised to decentralised perspective, we can look at development in a very, very different way, leapfrogging what's happening in countries that have already got centralised grids. Okay, my third D is digitisation. And so really, as the price of sensors and communication technology is starting to decrease, it's becoming much easier to embed these into different sorts of applications and use this to help better balance the grid, better manage the grid, do smarter things, and you know, we also hear about autonomous control and so on. So a very nice vision of what could be. Where are we at now? Well, I guess in the UK, one of the main ways we're trying to smarten our grid is with the smart meter rollout, and we could have endless debates around whether smart meters are smart or not. But regardless, we have this big vision, and it's actually proved quite difficult to achieve. So I don't think that those percentages are right. I think they may have been in the template and somehow come through rather than being removed. So ignore the percentages there. But what you can see is that right now we've only got about 10 million smart meters installed, and we've only got 2 years to get to 52 million. So it's looking like a pretty big challenge. So digitisation is there. It's an exciting topic. Perhaps there are other things to think about when implementing it, and how it all kind of works together. But definitely something that has the potential to revolutionise energy systems. And again, it's not just in developed countries. So in the example in Kenya I just talked about with those batteries, one of the things that we were doing was we were setting up the batteries and enabling us to kind of track how energy was used over the course of days, weeks, months. And that really allows us to see, is the battery being used in the right way? Is it too big? Is it too small? Because obviously this has an impact on cost. And it can help us learn and improve and continue to optimize. So the kind of digitisation opportunities definitely have the potential to help us improve the way in which we develop energy systems. All right, the fourth D is democratisation. And this is where I start to get really excited, because what we're starting to see is more and more homeowners, communities, different groups start to take an interest and an engagement in their energy systems. And I feel like the energy system is something that we had become so kind of removed from. You know, you walk around your home switching on lights and so on, but you don't really think about what's going on. And now we're starting to see people take back the power and form community groups. And in the UK, there are now 222 different organisations, according to Community Energy England's recent report looking at the state of the sector. And that's really exciting, because this is communities all around the country getting engaged in their energy systems, realising value from their energy systems and starting to deliver benefits back into their community. And they were engaging in projects, and you can see most of the projects that they were engaging in were around electricity generation, so a lot of PV projects or some wind projects, quite a few around energy efficiency and demand management, just one on energy storage. But I think that this is going to start to change in the future. But again, very exciting to see community groups and unusual actors getting involved in what has traditionally been quite a closed ecosystem of actors. And it is important to think about working with communities, and perhaps it's not entirely evident when we think about it in the developed context, but in the work we were doing in Kenya, it was really, really important for us to work with the communities when we were thinking about the development. Because there have been lots of instances where funding from various developed countries has gone to be used to create sustainable solutions in developing contexts, and it sometimes doesn't work. And so I did some work in Vanuatu, and we were going around and we would see these PV panels and stations that had just been abandoned, and they'd been installed, I think, by the Japanese government in this context. But the communities weren't engaged in that. They didn't see the value in that, and these assets ended up being stranded. And so what we wanted to try and do in our work was think about how you can actually work with communities to understand what they want and design a system accordingly, so a system that is fit for purpose. So how can you bring in the end users to make sure that the system you're developing is fit for purpose? And so in this instance, what we did was we held a load of focus groups with the communities. We asked them what they wanted. Why did they want energy? What did they want it for? And we started putting pictures together on a board of things that people were saying. And then we got them to vote, just using little markers. But what this helped us do was to map out which services they wanted to have in their homes. And so there were a number of small services that were kind of there as standard, like mobile phone charging is kind of the most important thing. Everybody has a mobile phone. They may not have power, but they have their mobile phones. But then the next thing they wanted a TV, they wanted a cooker. They wanted that before the fridge. But by thinking about the sort of economic benefit it could deliver, as well as how much power and energy it would need, helped us think about actually what is the most appropriate system design to be able to deliver services that are valued and to deliver services that the community would then be willing to pay for. And it wasn't just household services, we also looked at how could you deliver economic benefit into those communities. So again, health centre, education, things like that were in this community the most important. But by understanding this, it meant that we could really work with the community to develop that system that is fit for purpose. So that's 4D. So the 5th D, I'd be really remiss if I didn't talk about the declining costs, because this has been a huge driver of change. And so for me, this is just kind of quite a stark example of how PV costs have declined. And you can really see that turning point around 2008, and the costs have just plummeted. And so back in sort of 2008, we really needed feed-in tariffs and so on to make these technologies competitive and interesting to adopt, but they're now reaching prices where they are competitive in and of their own right. And it's not just that, we're also seeing storage costs declining as well. So this kind of investment in innovation to support cost decline is going to be a huge aspect of what's driving the transition. Okay, so having chatted about all of that, what does it mean? And how do these things that are going on change the way that we need to think about energy systems? And so I have a few things I want to talk about. So first of all, back to that decarbonisation point. So I really harped on before about electricity systems and how electricity systems need to decarbonise. End of coal, end of gas, we need more renewables on the system. But that's not the whole story, because we also need to think about decarbonising heat, decarbonising transport, and you can see that they are much bigger pieces of the pie than electricity. And as they decarbonise, some of them electrify. And so that is going to change the game completely. It's going to mean we need to be generating more. So at the same time, we've got to try and drop our fossil-based power stations, but we may need to be generating even more to deal with these resources. The second thing that all of this sort of makes me think about is around the network. And that, you know, I said we're shifting from something that is generation kind of at one end to end users on the other, but now we're starting to see bidirectional power flows along the network with renewables, with energy storage, and we need to think about much more active network management. So all of this needs to be in our minds as well. And to manage that and to think about the grid services that we need to provide to make the grid operate, well, actually, these grid services are no longer just being provided by the big power stations. They're actually now being provided by all different sorts of actors. Industry's been one that's been doing it for a while with demand response initiatives, but we're now seeing that happening in households, particularly homes that have PV, that have storage, and we're seeing sort of virtual power plants coming online and giving homes a new way to interact. Communities are often providing that service, and of course, grid-scale storage. So particularly in the US, we're seeing a lot of utilities investing in large lithium-ion batteries to provide services into the grid to help balance the grid. But it's not just technical. There's kind of a cube that we can fill when we think about how to deliver services to the grid, and technology change is one of them, but there are kind of two other dimensions that we can think about if we really want to think about how can we truly deliver grid services, and one is by changing our activities. And so I'm just going to jump to think about what that might mean for somebody in their home that's trying to provide grid services and flexibility into the grid. And if you've got, say, electrical heating, for example, you could start, the activity change might be that you change the times at which you use that technology. Or it could mean that you, say, instead of turning on the heater, you put a jumper on instead, or something like that. You're changing your activities. And then the third dimension is around kind of our service expectations. And so perhaps sticking with that example of what thermal comfort is like in a home, instead of heating your home to maybe 22 degrees, you think about, actually, I'm happy for it to have a boundary. And so instead of being exactly at that temperature, maybe I'm happy for it to go, you know, a few degrees hotter, a few degrees colder. So by changing the service expectations, we can start to open up a bigger opportunity for delivering grid services and providing demand response capacity. And so for me, like I said, all of this, when I think about all of this together, and a lot of this has come out of research that's been done by my colleagues in this research program, what I believe we need to do is we need to, on the one hand, be thinking bigger, and on the other hand, be thinking smaller, or in more granular terms. So we'll break those down. So thinking bigger, we need to be thinking bigger across space. So we need to be putting the consumers at the heart of our energy system, but we can't separate the way that we have done traditionally of thinking about the supply and the transmission side and modelling that, and then thinking about people in their homes and dealing with the social side. in completely separate areas. We need to start thinking about the whole system. And there is a lot of kind of exciting work going on doing this. So the Energy System Catapult in the UK is running a big program looking at the future power system architecture. And they're really starting to say, like, how do we manage the whole system? How do we bring consumers into the heart of it? And how do we bring together knowledge from people that understand supply, that understand transmission, that understand distribution, and that understand consumers? How do we bring them together to start to model and manage the whole energy system? And it is a challenge. We also need to be thinking bigger in terms of time. And so this is just a graph showing how demand for gas in the UK varies, and a lot of that is because of heating load. And what you can see is during the winter it's a lot more than during the summer. So when we think about the electricity grid, if we're starting to decarbonise gas and increase our kind of electric heating, we need to be thinking more across, what does this mean for the entire year? How do we think about balancing the grid across the entire year and having generation that can meet that demand for the whole year? Or maybe we need new forms of storage, but we can't just be thinking about balancing the grid on a day-by-day basis or even sort of intraday. We need to start thinking about that in bigger periods over time. And we need to be thinking about that between years, because the amount of heating that's needed will vary quite a lot depending on whether it's a cold year or a warm year, and depending on how much of our heating we're electrifying. So as we start to design the grid out, we really need to be thinking much further forward in terms of time. And and so just that kind of example, if we were going to electrify all of this demand, that is much more than our current grid is able to cope with, much more than our supply capacity has. So we really need to start thinking big in terms of time. And this also means we need to start thinking across boundaries. And so something that my colleagues are looking at a lot more, particularly my colleagues that are focused on decarbonisation of heat, is opportunities for power to gas. And so for years we've been using gas to generate electric power, and now we have an opportunity to kind of flip that and think about how can we use renewables to potentially generate gas. And so we may have power coming in from wind and solar, and some of it may go straight onto the electric grid. Some of it may go into the gas grid or into gas storage and be used directly. And some of that may be converted back to the electric grid. But basically, it's a much more complex picture, and we can't be thinking in silos again. We can't be thinking just about electricity and just about gas, but we need to start thinking about them in an integrated way. We also need to think big across actors. And so we've traditionally thought about the energy system as the kind of typical big players, big utilities. But that's not the case anymore. We've got homes, we've got communities, and we've got a whole lot of new players in there that are trying to meet the needs of these new types of consumers. And so we've started to really broaden up the sort of actors that are involved in the electricity sector. And so how do we think bigger across the actors? So we need to start thinking bigger, temporally, spatially, and socially. But we also need to start thinking smaller or more granularly, temporally, spatially, and socially. So what do I mean by that? So thinking about it in the sort of spatial dimension, we need to be thinking in more granular terms when we're looking at balancing the grid. And so we used to be able to just kind of think about it from the transmission side of things, but now what we're seeing is constraints in all parts of the network. So no longer just in the transmission, but all down the network. So this is just an example from Western Power Distribution's network down into Cornwall. And you can see that pretty much all of their different routes are under constraint. And so we can't just think about it at one scale. We need to be thinking about it right down to the distribution networks when we're thinking about where there's stress in the system and how we balance that. And what complicates matters even more is that stress in the distribution network is not always at the same time as stress in the transmission network. So this was some work we did looking at, I think this is in Oxfordshire actually, looking at stress at the same time period at the local level, city level, and national level. So you can think about that at low voltage, medium voltage, and high voltage networks. And red means it's stressed. And what you can see is that, okay, sometimes they overlap, but they don't always overlap. And so what we're seeing is that those stress periods are not always at the same time. So we need to be thinking much more granular in terms of the managing the networks. We also need to be thinking more granular in terms of managing the networks in time as well as space. And so when I think of solar, I often think of, okay, it generates in the day and not at night, but we always see these nice kind of bell-shaped curves, but that isn't the case. You get some rapid cloud cover moving, and you can get quite rapid sort of peaks and troughs in generation. And when you start to see lots of solar in the same place, particularly when we think about, say, kind of community initiatives where communities are trying to become more energy independent, we really need to think about what that means in terms of balancing the grid over time, because our demand might not be up and down and varying in the same way that supply starts to vary. And it's not just generation, we also need to be thinking that in terms of demand. And so this is just looking at what might change in demand if we started to electrify transport. But the electrification of heat and transport really raises some questions about how we think about demand over time, because with existing loads, we are lucky enough that a lot of them are not always coincidental. So, okay, you have a high load, for example, your kettle, one home turns it on, another home may use it at a different time, and so this balances out when you think across sort of tens or hundreds of homes, we start to get some balancing out of the load. But electric vehicles and heating don't have those properties. They're going to be coincidental. So if we start to electrify transport or electrify heating, we could be generating significant peaks on the system at quite short periods of time. And so we really need to start to be thinking much more granular in terms of time when we're managing it. And then we need to be thinking more granular in terms of what this means for people. And so this is just a news article from last year, sort of the outrage that homes that had solar would start to see an increase in energy bills. And what this all came down to is around network charging. So when you think about your electricity bill, I don't know about you, but I always just get my electricity bill, it's a number, I just assume it's for the energy I've used and I pay it. But it's actually broken down, and some of it's for the energy I've used, and some of it is to do with my use of the network, the infrastructure. I have to pay for that infrastructure that I'm connected to. And so obviously people with solar, they're using less of the network, they pay for less of the network. But who then pays those additional network costs? Do they fall on people that don't have solar? Potentially people that can't afford to have solar? Are we going to be increasing costs for people that can't afford to? And so for me, there's a big question here, thinking about people that have solar and people that don't, and how do you distribute costs fairly for these different types of customers in a world where some people may be asset owners and own resources and some people may not? And often the people that aren't are renters and people that can't afford to. And you know, the argument would be kind of okay for people with solar if they really did use less of the network. But some of my colleagues recently did a study, and no one before had actually looked at in the UK how much energy people with solar were using within their own home. So what that kind of level of self-consumption was. And there was an expectation that it was quite high. And what their analysis showed when they finally managed to get hold of all the data was that actually it was a lot lower than we initially thought. And this has some implications. So first of all, it means that people with solar aren't saving as much as they think that they are or could be, because they're not using as much of their own energy as they could be. And so I'll just break this graph down. So the blue curve is what their solar panel's generating. The yellow is how much of that they are using themselves in their home. So what you can see here is that all of that yellow, if they didn't have solar, they'd be buying that energy from the grid. So they are saving money in this sort of average home from our data. They are saving money because they're buying less energy. They're still buying some. You can see the kind of teal colour in the outside when solar's generating overnight, those imports. They're still buying some energy from the grid. But what really kind of surprised me was how much energy they are generating and not using. So the green is the amount of energy they are generating, not using, and feeding back to the grid. So whilst they are saving money by not buying electricity from the grid during that daytime period, they're still using the network, and they're actually using the network more than they would be otherwise, because the total amount of green, of exports that they're putting in is more than they're actually pulling. So this raises questions when we start to think really granularly about how different sorts of customers are using energy and harnessing their assets. We can start to see that the effects of this kind of decarbonisation, decentralised generation can be quite different for different sorts of customers. And it's not just about people that have solar and people that don't have solar. There are other ways that that our energy revolution is affecting us differently. And another thing that's been talked about quite strongly is carbon taxes, and the fact that we need to be thinking about putting carbon taxes on to support the decarbonisation goals. And one of my colleagues did some work in Ireland, and he looked at where were the inequalities if we applied a carbon tax. And what he found was actually there are a lot of different factors that drive inequalities in impact. And so location, so where you actually were in the country, your occupation and your education were kind of key factors in this. Some of that is because it's not just about the electricity side of things, but also say transport fuel side of things. And so depending on your occupation, you may or may not be using more transport fuel. Age was a factor, your household structure, as well as your dwelling property, including your heating characteristics and your appliances. So there are lots of factors here that are driving social inequalities. And so we need to start thinking much more granularly when we look at the impact and the implications of what an energy transition means on people. Okay. So what? So what does all this mean? Like, how can we then take all of this knowledge and think about how we create an energy system fit for purpose into the 21st century and beyond? So the first thing that's come up quite a lot in our work is that we really need to rethink markets and business models. The first way we need to rethink them is around costs. And so very simply, the way in which a coal or gas power plant works is, it costs a certain amount to build, but then you have these ongoing costs of burning your fuel. Wind and solar is very different, and your cost structures are very, very different. Once you've built the thing, you're generating energy for free. And so the way in which our energy markets account for costs and put their pricing points doesn't work as we start to see a shift from fossil-based generation to wind and solar. And we've seen this, and you probably saw some news stories about where power prices went negative. Not for customers, of course, but in the wholesale energy markets, power prices went negative. Generators were being paid not to generate energy, which is crazy. So we really need to start to rethink how we attribute costs in this different sort of market, this different sort of marketplace, to make sure that we're appropriately incentivizing investment in the right sort of resources and operation of the resources as well. We also need to rethink our markets to redefine those boundaries, as I was saying. So we should no longer really be thinking about heat, transport and mobility as entirely separate entities, but we need to think about how do our market structures really start to account for those interdependencies between those fuels as well. And of course, the third one, which I personally think is one of the most interesting points, is how do we rethink our market structures to engage more actors? And we've seen more and more in the media about peer-to-peer energy trading options, where if I have PV on my roof, then maybe I can sign up and sell it to my next-door neighbour that doesn't. But our regulation frameworks, our governance frameworks, our policy frameworks are not set up really to account for that right now. And so something that we really need to think about redefining is how do we engage different sorts of actors in different ways so that we can deliver value back to those actors. So if you have an asset on your roof, you should be making the most of that. But how can we simultaneously be delivering value to the grid? Because right now, our system is not set up in that way to think about how to simultaneously deliver value to end users and the network. So we need to really start to redefine our markets and the business models to think about engaging actors in new ways. The next thing we need to rethink is our infrastructure. And so we were really lucky. Maxime Ferk, who's from Ofgem, has spent some time working with our program and really looking at what does this mean for networks? How do we redefine how networks should be charging? I talked before about, you know, some of the issues to do with whether people have PV or not and how do we attribute network costs. But we're starting to rethink how we manage networks. So how do we rethink how we charge for them to kind of incentivize an optimum generation profile through the network? So networks are most effective if we can try and keep energy kind of as flat as we can across the day. And that's not what we're doing. We're seeing more and more kind of peaks and troughs, and that is not an effective way to manage networks. So how do we rethink network charging so that costs are fairly allocated amongst different groups that are using the network and incentivize kind of the best management of the network? But it's not just networks. Like, how do we think about different sorts of infrastructure? So storage is a really big one. The price point of storage is coming down, but it's not yet at a place where it's really that attractive. But we are starting to need more and more storage to help balance the grid. It's delivering a service that is of huge value, but that value can't really be captured properly yet in the markets. So how do we redefine the way which we charge for infrastructure and how infrastructure can recapture that value, that high initial outlay, to provide the grid services that we so desperately need it to provide without being subsidised, because subsidisation may work for a time, but it's not a sustainable solution. The third thing that we're looking at that we really need to rethink is innovation. And particularly encouraging innovation that can kind of support the environmental systems. But one thing that often comes to my mind, and we were just talking about storage, is that most of the storage that we're seeing deployed on the grids, and like I said, particularly in the US and in Australia as well, where we're seeing these kind of huge grid-scale lithium-ion storage facilities being put in, that may not be the best sort of storage for the grid. It wasn't designed and developed for grid services. It's actually, you know, we're kind of piggybacking off the automotive industry, off the telecommunications industry. You know, like our batteries have been brilliantly developed for phones, for computers, and for electric vehicles. But the characteristics of those batteries, while great for automotive and telecommunications applications, may not be the best for grid applications, particularly if we're looking at decarbonising heat and decarbonising transportation and increasing technologies like wind. Now, rather than just having to balance the grid on a very short time frame, like I said, we need to think about those longer timescales. So other types of storage might be more suitable. They're not at the right price points to be competitive. So how do we think into the future and stimulate innovation in those technologies that we might desperately need? It's very easy to just back the cheapest horse right now, but the better horse might be one that isn't attractive right now, but we need to think about the way in which we can stimulate innovation to support that technology coming online in the future when we really need it. And the last thing that we really need to redefine is how we work together. And so people are becoming more and more engaged in energy systems, but we don't yet, the bigger energy companies don't really understand how to talk to people. Network companies who are directly connected with people through the infrastructure do not communicate with end users at all. There's a barrier between us, which is the kind of the energy company's role. We're seeing more and more different and varied groups generating energy, playing a part in the system, but we haven't redefined those rules of engagement. We don't have governance models that can appropriately account for citizens at kind of all scales and all levels. And so we're sort of embarking on some really interesting work to say, what does that mean and how do we do this differently? And I'm really sorry if my talk's probably raised more questions than given you answers, But a big part of that is because we don't have the answers yet. What we're starting to do is to break down the barriers between the disciplines, between the silos, and start to work together to address these issues. The big challenge that we've sort of started to address is identifying what those issues are. Now we're trying to really work on them. And I think for me, this is going to be the real kicker. How do we start to work together from policy makers, bringing in local government as well, all the way down to communities that are really engaging and starting to own more and more assets. So, I just want to say thank you for your time. Thank you to all of the amazing team at Oxford that contributed to the work that I've talked to you today about. And I'm going to pause there because I think my time's up anyway and invite questions.